So is the hat like a brand thing? Because you always wearing the hat. What you carry?
Yeah, so rarely am I without it. I mean, I am bald myself, but it stands out. There's three guys in this race that basically all have the same name. There's Matt, Max, and Mac all running for the same seat.
God.
So Matt with the hat is what I tell people to like help them keep it organized. But it's also just the messaging. Like I'm a working class guy, been working in restaurants for 13 years. And so I really try to put that forward with everything else that I do. And I feel like it comes through, you know, the people that I'm trying to stand up for and the branding that I am trying to represent.
Yeah, you're very authentic. That's part of the reason why I definitely wanted to have a follow-up conversation, is because a lot of people, definitely when they're coming from a background such as, the service industry or, blue collar work or something that isn't uh, necessarily associated with DC intelligentsia, making the jump over from one area to the next while getting informed about issues that are not the immediate tabletop, kitchen counter issues of how, getting inflation down, dealing with the price of living, dealing with the cost of housing. I think it's important during that transition to make sure that those candidates have free, accessible resources, can have conversations about this, kind of learn on the fly while trying to go against people who are going to have tons of consultants, many of them not associated with those directly on the ground, not associated with those directly, affected by the wars, but though definitely in many cases directly associated with those who profit from them. And so that's part of the reason why I wanted to talk to your campaign. And I thought this was definitely a good example as a conversation we can show to people about how these conversations in private usually go. Because we like for these to usually be off stream, because we like to make sure that candidates feel that they don't have like prying eyes, that they can ask questions that they might feel uncomfortable with, or something that they would want to make sure that it can't be misconstrued because, without context. And so that's why we like having those conversations in private. But you suggested having this conversation actually on stream, letting the people see. You said everybody knows what I'm about. Everybody knows I'm transparent. Everybody knows what I stand for, and I want people to know what I stand for. I was like, okay, fine. We're absolutely happy having this conversation publicly, and it gives us a good chance to show people how these conversations go. I already introduced myself last conversation. Nizar has introduced himself in the last conversation as well, but since more people are watching, I'm going to have Nizar introduce himself, and then we can have you introduce yourself for everybody that is watching on my end that might not be familiar with the office that you're running for. Nizar, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, sure. Hey, folks. My name is Nizar Rifai. I'm a Lebanese-Ukrainian citizen, and these days, from the stuff that's relevant, I could mention working with Offbeat Research. I'm our Ukraine liaison here, and I coordinate and help the work of journalists such as Dylan and our other colleagues, and it's more or less, a job that requires you to be up to date to a very high degree on, how things are happening, what's happening, always trying to stay in the loop of what goes on. I've also had unfortunate experience of living practically tangent to Russian occupation during 2022 when a large number of the neighboring villages were occupied by Russian forces, and Russian soldiers tortured and executed our relatives, as well as many people we knew, neighbors, people you've heard of from the neighboring villages. And we still live with the scars of what that occupation, even though it was short-lived and thankfully it didn't last for long, but we still have to live with what those people left. Fortunately, today, I guess I'm going to be talking in that context. What kind of things we have to go through with living with.
Thanks, Nizar. And I think there's a lot of people who might not be familiar with your campaign, who's not from your district, not from your area, and it's just like tuning into this, like, hey, what's this conversation about? So, where are you running? What's your background? And why'd you run for office?
Hello, everybody. My name's Matt Fulmer. I'm down here in Hilton Head, South Carolina. I'm running for South Carolina Congressional District 1. My background is not going to be different from most of y'all's. I've been working in restaurants for the last 13 years. I have a degree in economics that I haven't really used. I'm just a typical guy. I make the amount of money most people make. I have to navigate America in the way that most people do. And I'm sure, like many of you, we're ready for a version of politics that's much more reform driven. We want to see money get out of politics. We want to see we want to end this cost of living crisis. And we would like to be in a real democracy that actually has more political parties and empowers independent candidates. So those are the three rails of my campaign. And like many of you, I've been inspired by people all over this nation, people that are running from San Francisco to Maine, that are ready to really evolve what politics has been, so it's not just this pageant of rich people, and it's something that's really connected to the desires and dreams and the needs of all of us. It's a future that's no longer going to be built at our expense, but by and for all of us. And it's not up to any one person to save the world, but we all have a chance to contribute. So I decided to run for office down here in South Carolina. And this is a almost swing district. It's R+6. It's Nancy Mace's current district, who's now leaving to run for governor. So this is just a part of a much bigger project that's happening coast to coast.
I do want to put out there that Nancy Mace is currently ranked red in the Track Ukraine ranking system as one of the most outspoken voices against support for Ukraine, currently sitting in the United States Congress, and has been more than happy to go on many, many right-wing platforms and promote anti-Ukraine talking points. And so this is an election that Track Ukraine is watching very carefully. Now, I want to make sure that we could start with any immediate questions you may have, but if nothing immediately comes to mind, we can also just talk about the values of the organization, why we do, what we do, the specific things that motivate us to support Ukraine, or has drawn us to this war, and to either cover it, pay attention to it, film it, or you could just throw a question at us.
You got it. So is your audience all familiar with the Track Ukraine project so far?
Yes, they're familiar with Track Ukraine.
Okay. All right. If there was any other intro that y'all needed to do, I'd be happy. I know it might be confusing for people to figure out why I'm here. And I guess what I would want to let the audience know is that this has been a part of a conversation about, should I come on to Dylan's platform or bring Dylan onto mine? The whole spirit of this is actually to make sure we're bringing content outward into spaces it normally wouldn't be. And I have a lot of questions for Dylan and for his whole team that I thought maybe it'd just be better to do this in real time, so we can walk through this process together, so other people can learn as I'm learning, as opposed to just keeping it as something that would be constrained and off screen. But Dylan, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I'm just I admire that you want these conversations to be public, and you want other people to learn as you're learning, as you're getting involved in parts of the political sphere that you might have not been as involved in before, because your motivating area for involvement was obviously focused elsewhere, probably focused more locally. Other people can learn as well, learn with you, so they can see how you got to the conclusions that you got to. It's a more transparent process than a board meeting with advisors that you don't really know where they're coming from.
Absolutely. All right. Well, cool. I guess are we both good to go? All three of us?
Well, we are ready to go.
Okay. So I'm sure, as most people notice by now, that there's a huge contingent of people that agree with us. Sorry, excuse me. My goodness. What we would broadly call the left is growing an isolationist spirit. There is this idea that everything America touches turns to shit, and so the best thing we can do for the world is to just stay away. And this has entered the topic of Ukraine. There's many people out there that I'm sure most of your your audience would be familiar with, people like John Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs or Max Blumenthal, that really create or paint this picture of our involvement in Ukraine as being something that coaxed Russia to invade in an act of self-defense. And that if we simply pull away from the conflict, that it'll resolve itself. And it might not resolve itself as gently as we would like, or within our value, within the framework of our values that we would like, but it would resolve quickly, and balance would be restored to the world in a way that we're just protracting violence and struggle. So that's the beginning of this conversation. Why is that worldview wrong? Why does America need to stay involved with Ukraine and continue to contribute its money, its resources, its people, or its other efforts?
Sure. Do you want me to get this first, or would you like to get it first? Sure. So for me, I think that there's a few angles from an American perspective. There's a moral angle, and then there's a cynical, you can call it cynical, you can call it self-interested, what's best for the country angle, right? And obviously, as an American citizen, people would probably want to consider both, because I'd like to think that Americans think about what's good for them, and I would like to think that Americans also are moral people, or at least strive to be a more moral people every day, which is all we can do. Everybody's life is their first one. So the first thing for me from a moral angle is Ukraine had an atomic arsenal. Its scientists helped design the atomic arsenal. In fact, they were the leading figures in the designing of the atomic arsenal, because Ukraine was the center for science, one of the centers of science in the Soviet Union. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed, they went through record-setting inflation. And when I say record-setting, I mean at the time, it was the most inflation any country had ever gone through up to that point. We're talking like 10,000% inflation rates for a single year. This type of economic spiral from a country that was considered one of the more prosperous ones of the Soviet Union to the economic collapse that it experienced led to economic dilapidation that I can really only compare to setting people to their most base instincts of survival, where the most brutal example of this that I think kind of sets the tone is that there was a street kid crisis of homeless children that were becoming more and more frequently homeless, many of whom would then get addicted to different types of drugs, and then many of whom, to feed those substances, would then do whatever was necessary to make money, which included selling their own bodies, which was like a horrible, horrible period for Ukraine at that time, as the Soviet system had been neglected for so long that when it finally came down and it was combined with shock therapy, it created just a horrible economic mixture. And that was what set the tone for the conversations going into the atomic weapons negotiations. And so the United States gave Ukraine two offers. Number one, you can get rid of the atomic arsenal and we'll give you food aid. And there was Congress people on the floor saying, if they don't give up the atomic arsenal, then we won't give them the food aid. And then these people who are struggling to survive won't get that assistance. Mind you, Russia was given the food aid regardless. They get to keep their atomic arsenal. In fact, the agreement that the United States proposed was simply taking all of Ukraine's atomic weapons and giving them to the Russians with the missiles. And that was combined with violent threats from Yeltsin and the Russians that if Ukraine did not give up its atomic arsenal, and it decided to go through it because it thought that this would be useful due to the long history of Ukraine being invaded by Russia, then they would invade. So the threat of invasion combined with the threat of starvation was then countered with, if you do give up your arsenal, then you can get a security assurance from the United States and from Russia that will always respect your territory and will never use any force to subdue you or manipulate you. Use soldiers to do that. And that's what Ukraine ended up agreeing to due to the position it was in. That is a huge sacrifice for world security and, of course, American security, because we are an extension of the world. There's only two countries in history that gave up their atomic arsenals. South Africa, after the apartheid regime collapsed and the intention of atomic weapons was to hold up apartheid, and the other one was Ukraine. And now 50% of the countries that have given up their atomic arsenals are currently occupied. and have the assurances that they were given completely torn to shreds. And it took about a decade after the invasion in 2014 for the United States to get very serious about sending large-scale support only after the full-scale invasion. So for me, the idea of America telling a country to disarm and giving it security assurances while we held starvation over their head. Before then, when they were invaded, we told them not to resist in Crimea and to kind of accept what is necessary to make peace with a much larger power before eventually the policies that were crafted by American, European, and Russian legislators fails. Ukraine is then invaded full scale in 2022. And now there's a question of abandonment. But abandonment after disarmament, I think, is immoral. If Ukraine had never felt that their security was reliant on us, and we had never imposed ourselves on their atomic arsenal and on their security, if we said, you know what, I don't care for a globalized world. Anyone can have whatever nukes they want. Nuclear non-proliferation doesn't matter. Let's all have atomic bombs and a button ready to go. I'm sure that won't go poorly. Then okay. Yeah. But for me, the moral argument is, I think, very strong for that. We have a commitment to Ukraine from that perspective, besides the fact that the Russians have engaged in the mass displacement of people and bringing settlers into homes, despite the fact that there is an ongoing human safari, and that's what the locals call it, in Kherson, where Russians use drones to hunt locals, aid workers, rescue crews, firefighters. I've interviewed these people. The evidence of it is often posted by the Russians themselves in what can only be called as war gore videos. And, you know, it's mostly the elderly, to be quite frank. So it's quite, I think the moral argument from the United States is strong. I don't want to go straight into the, you know, self-interested arguments because I want to make sure that Nazar has time to speak, but I can speak to more of that later.
So I agree to a very large extent to what Dylan said, but what I would add with what you mentioned earlier about you know, abandoning and frankly, from a Ukrainian perspective, what we see it as siding with Russia and trying to pressure Ukraine into, you know, peace, quote unquote, according to what Russia wants. For us, that's not really peace. That's total surrender, and it's giving Russia the absolute hand, and it's ethnic cleansing campaign, and it's genocide. We've seen what Russia has done in occupied territory that was quickly deoccupied, you know, when it was a few months or a few weeks. And we have a good idea what happens in territories they've occupied for several years. You know, a lot of people think that giving up territory to Russia is just like, oh, they'll become Russian. It's not. Occupied territories under Russia are not Russia. You still cross a border. You still have different banking systems or different like problems with ATM machines and stuff like that. You still have different SIM cards. It's not Russia. It's the wild, wild west. These territories are ruled by literal thugs, by actual criminals who were the only people who were ready to work with Russia and who imposed their authority. Even people who were pro-Russia before the invasion, after they saw what Russian rules means on occupied land and what, you know, what Russia imposes when it rules these places, they were no longer pro-Russian. People who argue for a peace where Ukraine is abandoned and Russia just, you know, wins the fight. These are people who are arguing for Ukrainian genocide and Ukrainian ethnic cleansing, and no Ukrainian will agree or, you know, be on board with that. Now, whether you as Americans need to side with us or not, for me, that's a bit of a bitter subject, a bittersweet topic. Because, for example, on one hand, if it wasn't for American aid in 2022 and 2023 and the handful of Cold War, you know, practically broken weaponry that we received, Russia would have completely overrun us, according to many, you know, analysis and according to the Ukrainian military. A lot of the weapon systems that were handed were able to prevent a Russian victory and the death of so many more Ukrainians and the displacement of so many more Ukrainians. So, you can't but be thankful for that. But also, as someone who comes from the Middle East, as someone who's Lebanese with Palestinian ancestry, with Syrian ancestry, as someone who lived through the Bush's invasion of Iraq, and who had to, for many of us, it was the collapse of world. So many people lost their entire world, their entire lifestyle, their entire security, their entire way of life, and it just turned into absolute chaos, and brought forth some of the most regressive and some of the most backward thinking, violent ideology and organizations that we've seen in ages. For many, we don't always want to blame others for our own problems, but it was definitely a huge catalyst for what many Middle Easterners saw as like a real point of decline and rock bottom for us in terms of the rise of ISIS and all of that. And to a large degree, it was American foreign policy and American might that brought that on one way or another. So whether you should stand with us or not, I mean, right now your government is making it obvious where they stand. Donald Trump is fully on board with Vladimir Putin. He thinks that we are wrong to the lesser, the smaller nation should not stand up to the global superpower, and it is, the way that he treated Zelensky in office, the way that American foreign policy is towards Ukraine. For us, it just looks with how much they could get away with without ruining all of their alliances around the world. And if you guys want to continue that, and if that's what the American left, as you called it, wants to stand, it's your choice. But for us, we're going to keep resisting Russia. We're going to keep resisting occupation with whatever we have. And even if at some point that means that Donald Trump or whoever even starts giving military aid to Russia, we're still going to be fighting the Russians. This is not about American interests. This is about Ukrainian interests, and where American interest and what American interest is, that in the end, that's up to you guys and you people. I hope I answered your question to some degree or other.
That was great, and also it'll probably segue into whatever I talk about next. But I think just to try to consolidate the points, it's that this has echoes to Libya and, of course, Iran right now, that nations around the world are learning that the promises from the greater powers mean absolutely nothing, which encourages them to develop nuclear weapons as the only form of deterrent or defense that they have. Because we've seen with Ukraine as one example that when you do give up that deterrence, you actually increase the chance that you're inviting future violence onto yourself. So it seems to be Dylan's primary point, that we made a commitment that we're not upholding, and it teaches a lesson to nations moving forward that can put us in a much more dangerous future than we'd want to be in. There was another thought. Oh, I wish I had wrote it down, brother. I'm so sorry. Now I do remember. All right. Earlier in this conflict, I'm sure from many people who watch Breaking Points or other channels like this, it's sort of been reported that the UK and America backed Ukraine away from a peace deal, and that this has just been an effort to self-sabotage a peace deal, to bait Russia into their own version of a Vietnam, to slowly drain them, to slowly put them in a meat grinder. If this retelling of events is inaccurate, why is it inaccurate? Why didn't a peace deal happen earlier on in the Ukrainian conflict?
Sure. There's been quite a few books published about the negotiations at this point, because those negotiations are now nearly over 5 years old. So we're going on 5 years since then. So a book I would recommend for if somebody wanted to read about these negotiations, it's called Our Enemies Will Vanish. Is a book that also talks about a bunch of other stuff. I think it's one of the best books on the war, in my opinion. But it also talks in detail about how these negotiations went. There's also some other articles that have been published about the demands that were made at the time. But I want to also just put forward quickly that there are people who cynically view the war as an opportunity to undermine Russian military power. There are always going to be Kissinger-esque figures in the background who are only engaging in geopolitics for the cold interests of what they think is benefiting state power, right? That is, those individuals will always exist. Regardless of those individuals' existence, there's also, I think, one moment. Sorry, I think I saw something. Sorry, I thought I saw somebody ask something, but I got a little confused. Could you pose the end of that question again for me quickly?
Yeah, so we were talking about the.
Oh yes,
wait,
negotiation. Sorry, I got a little
No, no.
I got a little bit distracted. My ADHD sometimes undermines me.
It's all good.
So there are these people who engage in completely cynically with politics, but regardless of those cynical individuals, the Russians view Ukraine as part of Russia. And if NATO existed, if NATO did not exist, if the United States existed, if the United States did not exist, I don't think that would probably change. This is something that he can probably speak to more than I can because he's lived in the country for 14 years, whereas I've lived for the country on and off for going on 5. But those negotiations, when they occurred in 2022, the invasion had already started. The Russians had crossed the border. The world was now taking it much more seriously when before people were kind of off and on whether it would happen in the first place. It's part of the reason why when I hear like Mearsheimer talk about the war, talk about where it's going, he got everything wrong. He got the invasion wrong, that it wouldn't happen in the first place. And he used to say before the invasion that if it ever did happen, which it wouldn't, which was his position not only immediately before the invasion, but for years as he gave lectures, but that if it did happen, Ukraine would collapse immediately because obviously Russia is the largest country on the planet. It's a superpower, and Ukraine's, and he believed a lot of the Russian speaking. The idea if somebody speaks Russian, then they are Russian. Now, we're speaking a different language than American right now, but we still were able to separate ourselves from the English. So I think or go to Ireland, say, oh, you're speaking English. Are you English? And see how that goes. Mm-hmm. So there's like this type of simplistic thinking that also goes with a lot of realist school of thoughts that I think isn't all-encompassing, doesn't have enough aperture. Wasn't able to calculate the start of the war, and it wasn't able to calculate how negotiations would go. What happened was, and I think I'll just go straight to the middle of it because this is all I ever hear about when I think about the breaking points or the breaking points-esque position on negotiations. Boris Johnson walked into a room and then made everybody, we could have peace, but never mind. That's not what happened. What happened is that after the Russians got caught up in Kiev, they started to engage a little bit more rapidly with negotiations to get something because they didn't want to have the military humiliation of having to withdraw from Kiev. They were trying to find some outcome. And as negotiations continued, the sticking point wasn't that Ukraine needed all of their land back right now. That wasn't what Ukraine was demanding. The sticking point ended up being that the Ukrainians could agree to most of what the Russians were asking for when it comes to, we'll withdraw back to this point, X, Y, and Z. But the big thing that they wouldn't is the Russians asked for them to demilitarize. Yes, we'll leave once you get rid of your army. Once you cut your army in half, once you get rid of your tank stockpiles, once you get rid of your artillery stockpiles, once you get rid of all of the means by which you stopped our invasion this time, then we promise to not invade you next time. Now, considering how 2014 went, considering the fallout of the failure of the Minsk agreements, and considering how 2022 went, or any of the rest of Russian history when it comes to invasions and taking over Ukraine, you can go back to 1919 or whenever, I think the Ukrainians had good reason to be skeptical. And then after Bucha was liberated and the bodies were getting uncovered, there was this conversation that Nazar had about, well, what does occupation look like? Is it moral for us to leave our family members occupied in places where these graves are being formed, where people are going around with lists of the names of male members of the family into villages trying to figure out, this is not something that people felt that they could morally accept. And so that combined with what the Ukrainians saw as an unreasonable demand to disarm themselves after they had stopped the Russian army out of Kiev, led to the Ukrainians going to people like Boris Johnson and essentially saying, if we stick through this, if we keep on fighting, because the Russians will only accept us demilitarizing, which Ukraine saw as basically just surrender until 6 months later when they invade again. Will you stick with us? And Boris Johnson, one of the most pro-Ukrainian people in UK politics, said, absolutely, we definitely would stand with you, blah, 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 whatever, in the way he can say. So that's what happened as we know it 5 years on. Immediately after, there was a bunch of rumors about Boris Johnson stopped Ukraine from negotiating, but the details of the negotiations hadn't properly come out yet. And so that narrative got developed before people realized this is a burglar saying, okay, put down your gun and I'll go away.
Yeah.
Did you want to comment?
I mean, no, basically everything you said is accurate. Like one of I think the most standing out points for Ukrainians during those negotiations, what was said from Russia was the limit they had for the army, that Ukraine would basically agree to limit its army to these numbers. And like for everyone, it was just like, obviously this is some kind of joke, these aren't negotiations. This is just another, total surrender agreement, but just phrased differently. And just because like some people want to call it a peace agreement doesn't really make it a peace agreement. There was not going to be any peace from that agreement. There was just going to be a lot more dead Ukrainians. That's it.
Mind you, what was the threat of those soldiers to begin with? Did anybody think Ukraine was going to invade Russia? Did anybody think that Ukraine was going to take Moscow with their pre-war force was 150,000 men? Like the Russian army is, I mean, we're talking like over 1 million. Like it's just not really comparable. Not to mention the fact that before Russia invaded, Ukraine was moving towards getting rid of conscription. They were going to get rid of conscription. They were going to move to a 100% professionalized force. This was the long-term trend in Ukrainian military affairs. And it was the Russian invasion that allowed the Ukrainian army to balloon, because then they had, a national purpose to use the draft. Tons and tons of people volunteered at the start. And, the rest is history now.
That was my assessment of it as well, that what really stopped the early negotiations was just Russia's demand that Ukraine neuter itself to a point where they wouldn't be able to stop a future invasion. So thank you for illustrating all that for us. You've mentioned this in a previous conversation that we had, Nazar, that how much of Ukraine's defense has come at the hands of just volunteer militias and family members and people just picking up a gun and deciding to hold the line against a professional Russian military, which is on the other side of a picture some people paint of the Ukrainian military forcing its own people to fight. Would you like to illustrate or better describe the fighting spirit that exists within Ukraine today, or has that changed at all since the early days of the conflict?
No, it actually just solidified more and evolved into something that had to be efficient enough to actually make a difference in the war. And it started with like militias and small-time volunteer effort of let's get people, sleeping bags and, some socks. And it evolved into drones and eventually turned into, a lot of the people in our government are incompetent and they're not developing the military technology that our people on the front need. So we're going to have to do it ourselves. And a lot of stretches of the front are held and were held with painstaking volunteer effort. All of the little, what I call begging on Twitter and social media posts where, Ukrainians are asking for money for pickups or drones or tourniquets or helmets or night vision or whatever. All of that, that's not for nothing. And people aren't just doing that just because they, have nothing better to do. The entire front is held together with little stitching and patchwork from volunteer efforts. And in a lot of spaces, this was one of the main galvanizers and catalysts for anti-corruption, movements and anti-corruption directions that, even the government itself, they're like, okay, we need to, deal with our own corruption because we will not survive this war if we, do things the way we used to do or how the Russians do them. And, civil society was a big factor in helping the government itself trying to figure out, what to do. And it's still a very difficult battle. People who talk about corruption in Ukraine and those Ukrainians are corrupt. They usually have no clue what Ukrainian corruption actually looks like. They have no idea about what actual Ukrainian corruption cases Ukrainians care about. They have no idea about the scale of what kind of corruption goes on where. And if for the reality is, it's because it's very boring, it's very tedious. And even, when I start telling Dylan about some kind of, they uncovered this kind of scheme where, look, they had a little bank account set up here, and this went to this, and this went to this, and then they, stripped funds from the renovation of this building, and then, like, I'm seeing Dylan getting one. That's how corruption works. It's supposed to be boring, and like no one wants to look into it. And that's the kind of corruption we deal with a lot of the time. So yeah, and even if you look at things that Sternenko's fundraisers, Sternenko's Ukrainian social media personality, let's call him for a lack of better terms, who fundraises for drones and whose fundraisers have had an impact, big, I don't know, we can't really, get into how big it is right now without too much, analysis. But the guy really impacted the Ukrainian battlefield, and a lot of the innovation that comes on the battlefield comes from private fundraisers, comes from, from NGOs, from volunteers. This evolves into a lot more, intricate, let's call it organizations and frameworks. For example, Victory Drones, if anyone has ever heard of that, that's purely a volunteer effort. And Victory Drones is something that's helped train hundreds, even thousands of Ukrainian drone pilots for the war effort. It's a volunteer effort that's helped create a lot of technologies and, helped develop a lot of tech and AI stuff and software stuff that's being used on the battlefield. And a lot of other Ukrainian organizations and fundraisers. If you're in the ecosystem, all of them are like, you just know them off the top of your head. But, for a lot of people, they have no idea that this goes on. They just think it's Zelensky going out there and bringing missiles home. It's not. It's a lot more complicated than that. And when your life and the life of everyone is on the line, this is the only way that, you can keep going forward.
Would we trust that if there are additional aid packages sent to Ukraine that they would be put to the use we're hoping for? I mean, to what degree do we think corruption or something like that would wind up perverting their intent?
I can speak a little bit to this because there is oversight. There hasn't been 100% oversight over the entirety of the aid packages that have been given, particularly during the start of the war, because the oversight that would have been done couldn't have been done because our embassy fled the country. And so the people who might have been in charge of these types of programs or the administrators that would have been in the country were all being evacuated or had already been evacuated. And so there is some blank spots at the very start for, where this went and where that went. It's pretty difficult to actually do it in a way that's thorough without actually endangering the lives of those who are going to check that these munitions are used, especially now with the reality of frontline drone warfare, where you can be killed 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers if they're using, really, really long strike drones to kill you. And these inspectors need to get as close to the point of use to these munitions as possible to do good weapons inspections. But we do have data, and nothing has been shown so far of any Ukrainian munitions given by the United States to Ukraine being taken and sold on international markets or being taken out of Ukraine. I saw a lot of attempts to establish that was happening, but each time it would be something like, I remember Vivek Ramaswamy, who's running for governor in Ohio, ran for president a while ago. when he was running for president, he posted a video of a cartel member with a type of rocket propelled, anti-armor system over his shoulder. And he said, look, Ukraine is giving javelins to the cartels. They were giving them javelins and going over to the cartels. And he just misidentified what system it was. It wasn't the system that it was. Mind you, these are supposed to be the pro-gun people. But he didn't know what system it was. He didn't know where it came from. And eventually he ended up deleting it. But those are the types of rumors that people hear. And then they hear that Ukraine's corrupt. And then they put two and two together and think, we send them artillery shell gets sent to, some corrupt third party. But in the cases that I've seen, the munitions are getting to Ukraine. The munitions are being used as long as they can get to the front line without being destroyed. And the corruption that's happening in Ukraine is mostly financial corruption or kickback contract corruption, i.e., somebody could be misappropriating funds. And so I think this is something that probably the Europeans have to be more concerned about than the Americans most directly, because we were not a big provider of funds. We were much more provider in munitions that the Ukrainians got. And the second is contracts. So, hey, somebody made a new company. My friend made it. I'm going to give them the contract because, I want them to make money. They'll give me a kickback. This is something that Americans aren't even unfamiliar with necessarily, but this is the most popular, most frequent form of corruption in the country. And that is disconnected from a lot of defense procurement when it comes to the munitions we're dealing with. It might become an issue when it comes to things like military jackets, like somebody paying $5 more than they should have for military jackets. Right. But when it comes to the munitions themselves, then it's not really an issue in my view.
Yeah. What is the aid going to be used for? If there's another $200 billion allocated to Ukraine, where does that get us? Is the point to get back all Ukrainian land? Is the point to fight to a standstill? What actually brings the Russians to the table? And how much money do you think the Ukrainian military would actually need to get Russia back to the table?
At this point, if you're asking me personally, right now, of course, different people have different perspectives, right? So I can't claim.
You can only play armchair general so much. I get it. But
I know. I just, I try to be as transparent as possible here. But me personally, I look at it from two angles. I look at it from a defense economics perspective, and I look at it from a psychological perspective. I think from a defense economics perspective, the Russians cannot sustain current operations indefinitely. There will be a point where the machine breaks down. What the Russians are hoping for and have been praying for, and the strategy has been attuned for, is that the Ukrainian system will simply break down before theirs will. Is that they have less men, they are a smaller economy, they are more reliant on outside aid than we are, even though that's not completely true. 40% of artillery shells being used on the front line roughly are North Korean in origin. So they actually are quite reliant on foreign systems now. It's the one thing that North Korea really can produce in large quantities is artillery shells. So that it was kind of a match made in heaven at the moment for them, or in hell, depending on your perspective.
Right.
But so I think that the Russian system is dependent upon an attritional conflict that eventually drags the Ukrainians into collapse. It's part of the reason why they engage in negotiations in the way they do. Sure, we'll talk. Absolutely, we'll have a conversation. Zelensky, come to Istanbul and talk to Putin. Zelensky agrees. Oh, well, actually, we're going to send a much lower level delegation who's going to tell you we'll fight you for 21 years, just like we fought the Swedes, and we'll just kick it around for like going on 2 years now. And it's meant to drag it out so they can get to that point of collapse before getting a negative American response. And the negative American response could undermine their defense complex with tougher sanctions. There's a sanctions bill in the House and the Senate, co-sponsored by a lot of people, that would bring economic repercussions to those third-party countries which buy Russian oil. That is something that could be potentially disastrous for the Russian economy. It would also affect the world economy, but it's something that they don't want to see come about, or any other type of stronger sanctions. The majority of the components and the weapons that they're throwing at Ukraine, a lot of time are Western. American companies, Canadian companies, and they sell them to, say, Tajikistan or Kazakhstan or some third-party country who then imports it into Russia, and then you end up getting American industrial components in drones that are killing Ukrainian civilians.
Russian weaponry, the vast majority of Russia's advanced weaponry cannot function without Western components. Not function without American components, Japanese components, European components, Taiwanese components. They have no alternative for them as of now.
And the thing is, like, the reason we aren't going after them is, number one, we are worried about angering these third-party countries, right? There was a little bit of conflict between India and Trump, but what Trump found is when he had that confrontation, there was actually quite a lot of ground the Indians were willing to give on importing Russian oil. He didn't get them to agree to stop importing all of it, but he did agree to get them to decrease it. And that agreement did lead to, at least in a short period, a decrease in, the oil industry in Russia making the money that it did. And that is the main funder of the Russian war economy. So the finances for the war economy should be undermined. The industrial power, the components into the war economy should be undermined. And the companies that are profiting off of selling to third parties should be thrown stronger penalties. Now, the exact legislating of what those penalties would be, getting the inspectors in place, because no regulation matters if it doesn't have inspectors, if it doesn't have people who actually go there and enforce it. This is something that is definitely true when it comes to tenants' rights and tenants' laws, and it's also true when it comes to international law and the importation of different components for war making. Lastly, when it comes to the Ukrainian side, the question of, what more aid should be given to the Ukrainians. I think that's where the psychology of it comes in. The Russian war aim and the Russian strategy was eventually, at some point, the West will get tired of supporting Ukraine. They'll get tired of it. The Ukrainians are too small to resist us, and we'll eventually barrel them over. If the United States went off from we're supporting Ukraine to never mind, we're not supporting Ukraine to after this next session, here's another Ukraine aid package because negotiations have failed. What does that say to that Russian strategy of we can just outweight them? There's this idea that I think, I'm not the biggest Churchill fan in the world. People here love Churchill, though. They like that barrel of a man. He's a very striking image here. But one of the quotes was, Americans will always do the right thing after trying every single possible alternative. And so it could be that America, after failing for like a decade on Ukraine policy, then started supporting Ukraine seriously in 2022. That's how I view it, at least, really seriously in 2022. They did some support before, but the lion's share was then. Then they started to divert. Then they come back. It throws a wrench in that psychological profile of that plan from the Russian side that eventually they'll go away. Because even if they can get aid to stop for another year, what happens if in the next year after that, aid starts again? Especially if Trump, who's not going to be president forever, despite as much as he would want to be, he's going to go away one day. And in the Democratic Party, pro-Ukraine sentiment is what the base has. The base is very, very pro-Ukraine. And they've only gotten more pro-Ukraine since Trump has engaged in a policy of what I would call abandonment. So I think really any significant aid package at this point might be enough to force the Russians to engage seriously in negotiations, which should be the goal. I think that it would be great if Russia left all of Ukraine. Occupied territory is hell. There are Russian bulldozers currently trying to cover up the mass graves outside of Mariupol, which range between 25,000 to 80,000 outside of a city of 400,000. So when you think about exactly how many dead people that is out of that community, and that no UN inspectors have ever been allowed in. No international inspectors have ever been allowed into these territories, and they probably never will. It bothers me on a moral level, but I also need to think about this, who the people alive are the people we can save. That means the people in occupied territory, so there must be an agreement that includes them, that protects them, that doesn't just okay, you're going to stay in the torture factory forever. But also, we can't bring about Ukrainian liberation on the battlefield necessarily just by throwing a ton of resources at them. And I also practically understand that the political will would probably not exist for that. But the political will probably does exist to bring the Russians to the table realistically. And there are a lot of Ukrainians that would favor that outcome, favor, freezing it along the front line as we try to find a solution to these other problems. at a better standpoint in the future, at a better chance in the future. Because sometimes like we got to aim for the best of bad outcomes.
Nazar, just want to confirm with you, do you think that the most popular Ukrainian sentiment is some amount of ceasefire or even territorial secession to the Russian forces, if that means this conflict stops for good?
I believe so. People here are very strung out, and you know, for those of us who do have friends and relatives and loved ones in occupied territories, it's a nightmare concession to agree to. But to a lot of other people who don't have friends and loved ones, they just want this war to be over already. You know, no one wants peace more than Ukrainians. Believe me, no one has suffered more than Ukrainians.
Yeah. It seems to me that all good negotiations need both a carrot and a stick. If all you're providing is carrots, then the person on the other side of the table is going to ask for more and more. And so this is where the idea of America's alliance and support for Ukraine can actually resolve this conflict, as opposed to just a wave after wave of Russian encroachment. What would, I feel like we're coming up on a close of this. If America somehow does fully abandon Ukraine, I mean, what does the future look like? What would, and my understanding is that Russia is succeeding in taking more territory. Just definitely want to make sure we're giving Nazar all the time he has to talk about the Ukrainian experience as someone who's lived through it. If America did pull away and became more isolationist, what does the future of Ukraine look like?
I do also, sorry, I do want to just throw out there also that seceding territory for now does not mean that the majority of Ukrainians would recognize it. They would just accept it as a function of the current status quo. I just wanted to put that clarification out here. But yeah, Nazar, did you want to take that?
Yeah. Militarily speaking, right now, America, all aid has stopped. Since Trump took over, all military and non-military aid to Ukraine has stopped. The only thing that American government has over us right now is intelligence sharing and interceptor missiles. Intelligence sharing, having that go away would be bad, but it wouldn't be, you know, critical. The anti-ballistic missile interceptors and the Patriot systems, that going away would be a major problem for Ukraine. And it's one of the main, items that the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian diplomacy has tried to maintain going with Americans. Right now, Europe pays for any American-made weapon systems that Ukraine receives. So for America to completely abandon Ukraine, that means they would also have to completely abandon the Europeans. And they would have to put a veto on Europe buying American systems to give them to Ukraine, which would be very difficult. So basically, one of the, not worse, but like badder case scenarios that we had in terms of aid and military aid has already happened and has, happened since Trump took over office. But in a way, it also galvanized a lot of, opportunity and strength in a way, because the Europeans saw that, America can at some point just not become reliable, absolutely, if not an outright adversary. And everyone started to, the Europeans were able to plug the financial hole, and in many cases, the, hole left by military aid in terms of Ukraine. But it also started, doing things like having people develop and look towards new solutions that would be completely, separate from America and American technologies as far as possible. So that's like new interceptor missiles that might be able to handle similar workloads as the Patriots and other kinds of things.
All right. So that was it. Well, thank you very much, y'all. I know you do have an engagement in about 23 minutes, don't you?
Yeah, I have an engagement in 23 minutes, but I'm agile. So if you had another question, we could answer it. But I know that you also have a day ahead of you that you probably want to get to.
I just want to make sure that we're taking like the last segment to make sure that y'all are getting everything out of this exchange that you were hoping to get out of it. So if you have questions for me, or if you have anything to say to the audience, if there's any other way that I can elevate what y'all are trying to accomplish within 20 minutes, I'd be happy to do it.
Sure. I guess for us, the long-term goals of the organization is transparency for candidates, and you have met that standard by a mile and a half by wanting to go on stream, wanting to talk about that. You have a very transparent position, and people can see you get to the position you're at. And it's been interesting watching a lot of candidates kind of have to make their position on Ukraine in real time as they get asked by people who have seen what Track Ukraine is doing and want to make sure that there's like the sources for information out there. So that's something we care about. But we also care about, making sure that people have the message of what Ukraine and America's relationship has been, what the results would be. I mean, we didn't get into a lot of the detail of worst case scenarios, and I'm not one much for fear mongering, but the city of Zaporizhia, there's 600,000 people, 700,000 people that live there. The city of Dnipro, we're talking about another 600,000 people. Kharkiv, talking about like 800,000 people. Kramatorsk and Slovyansk are already within now Russian artillery range. These are all places where, combined, we're talking about millions of more displaced people, millions of more people questioning if they'd ever be able to go back to their homes again. And it could mean making Ukraine the most displaced community on the entire planet, depending upon how the war progresses, as they're already one of the most displaced communities on the entire planet. But we're talking about a size of territory getting occupied and a size of people getting removed from land. If they're unable to stop Russian advances, that would be a humanitarian catastrophe at such a scale that our great-grandchildren will read about our inaction and wince. I genuinely feel that way. Because right now it's kind of hard to think about it all in retrospect, looking back on the decisions we made to get to this point. But at that point, they will be able to. And so I'm doing my best to see how we got here and try to avoid that worst outcome, because it would really, I think, be a disaster. That's part of the reason why we want to have conversations with candidates and try to avoid that outcome. And we believe the Ukrainians are doing everything they can to avoid that outcome. And so I think that we should do everything that we can to avoid that outcome.
Yeah. I think in conclusion, just go back to this very first point that I brought up, that a lot of people think American isolationism is the best thing for the world. I just try to point out that everyone thinks they're the hero of their own story, whether you're America, whether you're Russian, whether you're Chinese. And what we've seen across time is these great powers do tend to intrude on other people's sovereignty for their own benefit. And I don't think that ends if America just packs it up and comes home. I think you're going to see just the opportunity for more regional powers to break out into conflict, which could lead to something like a World War III. And I also really appreciate the point that you led with, that Ukraine did have a nuclear arsenal, that it gave it up, trusting that nations like America would defend its sovereignty as it did. And similar to Libya, and now we're looking at Iran, nations are learning that nukes are really the greatest deterrents for your own survival. And that's not a message we really want the world to have. And of course, I have to thank you so much for all of your work. Nizar, I know we've talked a little bit prior to this conversation. I've heard stuff maybe some people on this channel haven't heard yet. And I'm really grateful and thankful to be with you and all the work that y'all have been able to pull together throughout this struggle. And thank you for all that you're doing. I'm still a candidate. I'm not in Congress right now, but I'm really appreciative of this experience. And I'm happy to empower y'all in what you're trying to accomplish. So if there's anything else I can do, you got my number. You got a friend in me. For chat out there that I can't see, thank you all for participating and being a part of this moment.
Thanks for talking to us. Thanks for engaging with us. And just keep being you. That's what you can do for me. Just keep being you. And don't get discouraged is the only thing. It's like, no matter what happens, just don't get discouraged. That's the only request I'll make of you.
We're not. I think this world is moving in the right place. We can see it with support for universal health care. We can see it in support for tax reform. I think America is becoming the kind of nation that we want it to be. It's just been it's been a minute of having to see it be a different kind of place before people realize the place they really want it to be. So thank you, y'all.
Awesome. This was a good conversation, and thanks again for talking to me. And good luck. Good luck in your election.
I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, brother.
Bye-bye.
Y'all take care. Bye now.